The wind howled through the weathered boards of the old house, carrying with it the perpetual dust of Mercy's Bend. Clara Whitmore stood at the kitchen window, her slender fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barren yard, illuminating the path she would soon walk, the same path she had walked every morning for the past 3 years. At 27, Clara possessed the kind of beauty that the harsh frontier life had not yet managed to steal away, though it had certainly tried. Her auburn hair, once vibrant as autumn leaves, now carried streaks of premature silver. Her green eyes, which had once danced with laughter, now held a perpetual veil of sorrow. She wore the black dress of mourning as if it were a second skin, the fabric worn thin at the elbows and hem from constant use. The house creaked around her, a symphony of loneliness that had become her only companion. Samuel had built it with his own hands, promising her it would be filled with the laughter of children and the warmth of a growing family. Now it stood as a monument to broken dreams, each room echoing with memories that cut deeper than any prairie wind. Clara set down her cup and reached for her shawl. The cemetery was a 15-minute walk from the house, situated on a small rise that overlooked the town. She made this journey regardless of weather, through the scorching heat of summer that cracked the earth beneath her feet, through the bitter winters when snow piled high against the headstones. Today, early autumn had painted the landscape in shades of brown and gold, though little grew in this unforgiving land save for stubborn sage and tumbleweeds. Mercy's Bend sprawled below her as she walked, a collection of wooden buildings that seemed to huddle together against the vastness of the frontier. The town had grown up around the silver mines, though those had played out years ago. Now it survived on cattle drives and the stubborn determination of people who had nowhere else to go. The church steeple pierced the sky like an accusatory finger, and Clara could already imagine the disapproving looks she would receive if she ventured into town today, the same looks she had endured for 3 years. The cemetery gate squealed on rusty hinges as she pushed it open. She knew every headstone here, had read every name until they were etched in her memory. The Garrett family, taken by scarlet fever, old man Thompson, who had drunk himself into this ground, the unnamed markers of drifters and cowboys who had met their end in this unforgiving place. And there, beneath the lone cottonwood tree that provided the only shade in this field of sorrow, lay Samuel Whitmore. Clara knelt beside the grave, her fingers automatically moving to clear away the dust and debris that had accumulated overnight. The headstone was simple. She couldn't afford more, bearing only his name and the dates that bracketed his too short life, 1847 to 1885. "Morning, Samuel," she whispered, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of routine. "The McKinney's mare foaled last night. I heard her crying out. A colt, they say. You always did love the spring foals." She spoke to him as if he could hear, telling him the small news of the town, the changes in weather, the trivial details that made up a life. It was easier than facing the silence of the house, easier than acknowledging that these one-sided conversations were all she had left. 3 years. 3 years since the mine collapse had taken him and 4 other men. 3 years of Sheriff Patterson stopping by with marriage proposals disguised as concern. 3 years of Theodore Banks, the banker, suggesting she might be more comfortable in his household as his wife. 3 years of fighting off the vultures who saw a young widow as either a prize to be won or a woman of questionable morals to be scorned. "Mrs. Whitmore." The voice startled her from her reverie. She turned to find Henry Morrison, the general store owner, standing at a respectful distance with his hat in his hands. Henry was a decent man, one of the few who had never pressed his suit upon her, though she knew he had recently lost his own wife to childbirth. "Mr. Morrison," she acknowledged, rising to her feet and brushing the dust from her skirts. "I don't mean to intrude," he said, his weathered face kind but tired. "I wanted to let you know there's a man in town looking for work, a cowboy, by the look of him. I remembered you mentioning your barn roof needed repair before winter sets in." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She had managed alone for 3 years. She could continue to manage. But the truth was that the barn roof had deteriorated badly in the last storm. Her few remaining chickens had nearly drowned in their coop, and she couldn't afford to lose what little livestock she had left. "What do you know of him?" she asked carefully. Henry shrugged. "Not much. Rode in yesterday on a horse that's seen better days. Goes by Jack Calder. Quiet sort. Keeps to himself. Has the look of a man who's seen his share of trouble, if you take my meaning. But he seems honest enough. Did some work for the Millers yesterday, and they had no complaints. A drifter. A man with no roots, no connections, no reason to stay once the work was done. Perhaps that was exactly what she needed. "Send him by tomorrow morning," she heard herself say. "If his price is fair, I'll consider it." Henry nodded and replaced his hat. "I'll do that. Mrs. Whitmore, you take care now." She watched him walk away, then turned back to Samuel's grave. "I know what you're thinking," she said softly. "But the roof won't fix itself, and winter's coming whether I like it or not." The walk home seemed longer than usual. By the time she reached the house, clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising rain that would likely never come. This land was stingy with its blessings and generous with its hardships. Clara spent the rest of the day in preparation, though for what, she couldn't say. She cleaned the already spotless kitchen, mended clothes that didn't need mending, and checked the henhouse twice. As evening approached, she found herself standing before the small mirror in her bedroom, studying her reflection. When had she become this ghost of a woman? When had the spark in her eyes dimmed to nothing? She turned away from the mirror and began preparing her simple supper, beans and cornbread, the same meal she ate most nights. The house settled around her as darkness fell, each creak and groan familiar as her own heartbeat. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, their calls echoing across the empty plains. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in the bed she had once shared with Samuel, staring at the ceiling and wondering why she had agreed to hire this stranger. It wasn't just the barn roof, she knew that much. Perhaps it was the weariness that had settled into her bones, the exhaustion of carrying her grief alone. Or perhaps it was simply time to admit that she couldn't continue this way forever, no matter how much she might wish to join Samuel in that quiet cemetery on the hill. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive, the clouds from the previous evening having settled low over the landscape. Clara was up before sunrise, moving through her morning routine with mechanical precision. Coffee, a small breakfast of bread and preserves, the checking of the chickens. Everything exactly as it had been for 3 years. She was wiping down the kitchen table when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Through the window, she saw a lone rider approaching, his silhouette dark against the pale morning sky. As he drew closer, she could make out details. A tall man, broad-shouldered but lean, wearing the typical attire of a working cowboy, worn leather chaps, a dust-covered coat, and a hat pulled low over his face. Jack Calder dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. When he removed his hat, Clara saw a face that might have been handsome once, before the sun and wind and whatever else had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. His hair was dark, shot through with premature gray, and his eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue and distant. He didn't approach the house immediately. Instead, he stood by his horse, surveying the property with the careful attention of a man who had learned to assess every situation for potential threats. His gaze took in the sagging barn roof, the broken fence posts, the general air of slow decay that Clara fought against daily but could never quite overcome. Finally, he walked to the porch, his spurs making soft music with each step. Clara opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Calder," she said, her voice steady despite the unexpected nervousness that fluttered in her stomach. "Ma'am." His voice was low, rough as sandpaper. "Henry Morrison said you might have work. The barn roof," she said, gesturing toward the structure. "It needs to be repaired before winter." He nodded, his eyes already moving to assess the damage. "Mind if I take a closer look?" "Go ahead." She watched from the porch as he walked around the barn, occasionally reaching up to test a board or examine the support beams. He moved with economy, wasting neither motion nor time. When he returned, his expression was neutral. "It's worse than it looks from here," he said. "The whole north side needs to be replaced, and some of the support beams are rotting. It's a week's work, maybe more." Clara's heart sank. A week's work meant a week's wages, money she could ill afford. But what choice did she have? "What's your price?" He named a figure that was fair, perhaps even generous, considering the extent of the work. She found herself studying him more closely, looking for the catch, the hidden agenda that experience had taught her most men carried. "That includes materials?" she asked. "I'll need money up front for supplies. The rest, when the job's done." It was reasonable, more than reasonable. So why did she hesitate? "You can start tomorrow," she heard herself say. "There's a room in the barn, the tack room. It's dry and has a cot if you need somewhere to stay." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. "I appreciate that, ma'am." An awkward silence stretched between them. Clara realized she should offer him something. Water for his horse, perhaps, or coffee. The basic hospitality that frontier life demanded. But the words stuck in her throat. It had been so long since she had entertained anyone. So long since anyone but Henry Morrison or the other persistent suitors had stood on her porch. "I'll be back at first light," Jack said, seeming to sense her discomfort. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." She watched him ride away, his figure gradually swallowed by the vast emptiness of the plains. Only when he had disappeared entirely did she realize she had been holding her breath. That evening, as she made her daily pilgrimage to the cemetery, Clara found herself telling Samuel about the cowboy she had hired. "He seems decent enough," she said, arranging the wildflowers she had picked along the way. "Quiet, respectful, the kind of man who minds his own business." The wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves, and for a moment, she could almost imagine it was Samuel's voice, giving his approval or perhaps his warning. But no, it was just the wind, as it always was. As she walked home, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and red, beautiful and violent as everything in this land. Tomorrow, a stranger would begin working on the barn Samuel had built. Tomorrow, her carefully maintained solitude would be disrupted. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and quickened her pace. Change was coming to her small, grief-shrouded world, whether she was ready or not, and somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the layers of sorrow and resignation, something stirred. Not hope, exactly, but perhaps its distant cousin, a tiny spark in the darkness, fragile as a newborn flame. The wind picked up as she reached the house, carrying with it the scent of rain that might actually fall this time. Clara stood on the porch for a moment, looking out at the barn that would soon echo with the sound of hammer and saw instead of silence. "Just to fix the roof," she whispered to the empty air. Nothing more. But even as she said it, some part of her knew it was already a lie. The sound of hammering woke Clara before dawn. She lay still for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar noise breaking through the silence she had grown accustomed to. Then she remembered. Jack called her, the cowboy she had hired to fix the barn, through her bedroom window. She could see a lantern's glow emanating from the barn. The man had said first light, but apparently his definition of the term was more literal than most. Clara dressed quickly, her fingers working the familiar buttons of her black dress by feel in the dim light. She paused at the mirror only long enough to pin up her hair in its usual simple style. The morning air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of impending rain. Clara wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and made her way to the barn, carrying a pot of fresh coffee and 2 cups, a gesture of hospitality she had debated throughout a restless night. She found Jack perched on a beam, already having removed a significant section of the damaged roof. Despite the cool morning, he had stripped down to his shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked by various scars. He worked with steady precision, each movement economical and purposeful. "Mr. Calder," she called up. He glanced down, seemingly unsurprised by her presence. "Ma'am, hope I didn't wake you. I'm usually up early," she said, which was true enough. "I brought coffee." For the first time since she'd met him, something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That's kind of you." He climbed down with the same easy grace she had noticed the day before. Up close, she could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the kind that came from more than just physical labor. When he accepted the cup, their fingers briefly touched, and Clara was startled by the unexpected warmth of the contact. They stood in awkward silence, sipping the hot coffee. Clara found herself stealing glances at him, noting the way he held himself, alert, watchful, as if expecting trouble even in this moment of quiet. It was a stance she recognized from some of the men who had passed through Mercy's Bend, men who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. "You've done this kind of work before," she observed, gesturing at the partially dismantled roof. "Here and there." He took another sip of coffee. "A man learns to do what needs doing." It wasn't much of an answer, but Clara didn't press. She understood the value of keeping one's past private. Over the following days, they settled into a routine of sorts. Jack would arrive before dawn and work until the heat of midday became unbearable, then resume in the late afternoon when the shadows grew long. Clara would bring him water, sometimes food, always maintaining a careful distance. They spoke little, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. Rather, it was the companionable quiet of two people who understood that words were not always necessary. It was on the fourth day that Clara noticed him favoring his left side. He had been lifting a heavy beam when something seemed to give way, causing him to grimace and press a hand to his ribs. He recovered quickly, but Clara had spent years reading Samuel's body language when he tried to hide injuries from the mine. "You're hurt," she said. It wasn't a question. Jack straightened, his expression closing off. "It's nothing. Old injury acting up." "From the war?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. She had recognized the signs, the way he moved, the constant vigilance, the scars. So many men carried such wounds, visible and invisible, from that terrible conflict. His jaw tightened. "Yes." Clara knew she should let it be, should respect the wall he had clearly built around his past. But something in his eyes, a flash of remembered pain, made her bold. "My brother fought at Antietam," she said softly. "He came home, but he was never the same. Used to wake up screaming, thinking he was back in that cornfield." Jack's shoulders relaxed fractionally. "What happened to him?" "Took his own life 2 years later. Said he couldn't live with what he'd seen, what he'd done." The words hung between them, heavy as stones. Clara hadn't spoken of Thomas in years, had locked that grief away with all the others. She didn't know why she was sharing it now with this stranger. "I'm sorry," Jack said, and she could tell he meant it. There was understanding in his voice, the kind that came from personal experience. That evening, it began to rain. A proper rain, not the usual teasing sprinkle that evaporated before it could do any good. Clara stood at her kitchen window, watching the water stream off the partial roof of the barn where Jack had managed to get a temporary covering in place. She should have been relieved at the moisture for her struggling garden. Instead, she found herself wondering where he was, whether the tack room was staying dry. Without quite deciding to do so, she found herself lighting a lantern and making her way to the barn. The rain had intensified, soaking through her shawl within seconds. She knocked on the tack room door, feeling foolish but unable to turn back. "Come in," came his voice. She pushed open the door to find him sitting on the narrow cot, cleaning his rifle by lamplight. His shirt was damp, and she could see him shiver slightly in the cool air. "I wanted to make sure the roof wasn't leaking in here," she said, though they both knew it was a flimsy excuse. "Dry as dust," he replied, setting the rifle aside. "Though I appreciate the concern." Clara hesitated in the doorway. Propriety demanded she leave immediately. A widow, alone with a man who was essentially a stranger. In the intimate confines of a small room, the gossips in town would have a field day if they knew. But the rain drummed on the roof, creating a strange sense of isolation from the outside world. And Clara found herself stepping inside and closing the door. "Would you like some company?" she asked, then immediately flushed at her boldness. "I mean, it's a fierce storm, and I thought—" "I'd welcome it," he said simply, gesturing to a wooden crate that served as the room's only chair. "Gets lonesome, listening to the rain alone." Clara sat, arranging her wet skirts as best she could. The lamplight cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the small space felt warm despite the dampness. "You were going to tell me about the war," she said, surprising herself again with her directness. Jack was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost lost in the sound of the rain. "I was at Chancellorsville. Took grape shot to the ribs. Should have killed me, but my brother—" He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to his left side. "My brother David dragged me 3 miles to the field hospital. Stayed with me for 2 days while the fever tried to take me. He saved your life." "He did." Jack's eyes were distant, seeing something beyond the small room. "Month later, he took a mini-ball to the throat at Gettysburg. I held him while he drowned in his own blood." Clara's heart constricted. She understood now the weight he carried, the guilt of survival that pressed down like a physical thing. "It wasn't your fault," she said gently. "Wasn't it?" His laugh was bitter. "I was the older brother. I was supposed to protect him. Instead, he died saving me. And for what? So I could drift from town to town, fixing other people's barns." "So you could be here," Clara said without thinking. "Right now, in this moment." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt exposed under his gaze. There was something raw in his expression, a vulnerability that he probably showed to no one. "Why did you really come out here tonight?" he asked. Clara considered lying, making up some excuse about checking on supplies or worrying about the horses. But the rain and the lamplight and his honest pain made her brave. "Because I've been alone for 3 years," she admitted. "And today, when I brought you lunch, you smiled, just a little, just for a second, and I realized I'd forgotten what it felt like to make someone smile." The silence stretched between them, but it was different now, charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. "Your husband," Jack said carefully. "You still visit him every day?" "Yes. You loved him very much." "I did. I do." Clara twisted her wedding ring, a gesture so habitual she didn't realize she was doing it. "But loving the dead is lonely work. They can't love you back." "No," Jack agreed. "They can't." They sat together as the storm raged outside, sharing the kind of conversation that darkness and isolation make possible. Jack told her about the places he'd been since the war, cattle drives to Kansas, railroad camps in Colorado, mining towns that sprouted and died like mushrooms after rain. Clara found herself talking about Samuel, really talking about him. Not the sanitized version she presented at his grave, but the real man, his temper, his dreams, the way he'd held her on their wedding night and promised her a good life. "He was wrong," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "About the good life. This place breaks everything it touches." "Maybe," Jack said. "Or maybe it just shows what's already broken." The rain began to taper off near midnight. Clara knew she should go, knew that every minute she stayed increased the risk of discovery and scandal. But something kept her in that chair. Some recognition that this moment, this unexpected connection, was as fragile and precious as prairie grass after drought. "I should go," she finally said, though she made no move to stand. "Yes," he agreed, also remaining still. It was another 10 minutes before she finally rose. At the door, she paused and looked back at him. "Thank you," she said, for talking with me." "Thank you for listening," he replied. "Been a long time since anyone has." Clara made her way back to the house, her clothes thoroughly soaked but her heart strangely light. She changed into her nightgown and lay in bed, listening to the last of the rain pattering against the windows. For the first time in 3 years, the sound didn't make her feel alone. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the world washed clean by the storm. Clara went about her morning routine, but everything felt different somehow. The coffee tasted richer. The air smelled sweeter. The simple act of gathering eggs seemed less like a chore and more like a participation in life's quiet rhythms. She didn't go to the cemetery that day. Instead, she found reasons to be near the barn. She brought Jack fresh water, then lunch, then afternoon coffee. They didn't speak of the night before, but awareness hummed between them like a telegraph wire. When their eyes met, Clara felt a flutter in her chest that she tried to ignore. It was late afternoon when she saw the riders approaching. 3 men from town, their purpose clear in the determined set of their shoulders. Clara recognized Sheriff Patterson's distinctive gray hat and felt her stomach clench. She met them in the yard, chin raised despite her racing heart. "Afternoon, Clara," the sheriff said, touching his hat brim. His use of her first name was deliberate, possessive. "Heard you've got a drifter working for you. I've hired Mr. Calder to repair my barn," she said coolly. "I wasn't aware that was anyone's concern but mine." "Everything in this town is my concern," Patterson replied, "especially when it comes to protecting our womenfolk." Behind him, Theodore Banks nodded sagely. The third man, Reverend Michaels, had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I don't require protection, Sheriff. That's what you think now." Patterson's eyes were hard. "But a woman alone, vulnerable. It's not proper. Clara, what would Samuel think?" The use of her husband's name was like a slap. Clara felt her hands clench into fists within the folds of her skirt. "What Samuel would think is no longer relevant," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "He's dead, Sheriff, and I'm alive, trying to keep a roof over my head. If that offends your sensibilities, I suggest you look elsewhere. Now, Clara, Mrs. Whitmore," she corrected sharply, "and I'll thank you to get off my property. All of you." Patterson's face reddened. "You're making a mistake. That man, nobody knows anything about him. He could be dangerous." "The only danger I see," Clara said, "is from men who think they have the right to tell me how to live my life." She turned her back on them and walked to the house, her spine straight despite the trembling in her legs. She didn't look back, didn't watch them leave, but she felt their eyes on her like brands. When she finally allowed herself to look out the window, they were gone. Jack stood by the barn, having clearly witnessed the entire exchange. Their eyes met across the yard, and in his gaze she saw a question. Clara stepped onto the porch. "The barn roof still needs fixing," she called. "Unless you've changed your mind about the job." A slow smile spread across his face, the first full smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his features, making him look younger, less burdened. "No, ma'am," he called back. "I haven't changed my mind about anything." As he returned to work, Clara remained on the porch, feeling as though she stood at the edge of a precipice. Behind her lay 3 years of safe, suffocating grief. Ahead, she didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time since Samuel's death, she wanted to find out. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its evening song. Clara closed her eyes and listened, letting the music wash over her. When she opened them again, Jack was watching her from his perch on the barn roof, and she didn't look away. The morning after the sheriff's visit dawned cool and clear, with a crispness in the air that hinted at autumn's approach. Clara stood in her garden, surveying the damage the recent storms had wrought. The tomato plants lay flattened, their stakes broken, and the bean rows had been washed into muddy rivulets. "Needs replanting," came Jack's voice from behind her. She turned to find him holding 2 cups of coffee, a reversal of their usual routine that made her smile despite the garden's sorry state. "I was never much of a gardener," she admitted, accepting the offered cup. "Samuel did most of this. I've just been trying to keep it alive." Jack surveyed the plot with a practiced eye. "Soil's good, just needs proper drainage and stronger stakes. I could help, if you'd like." The offer hung between them, weighted with more meaning than simple garden work. This was beyond fixing the barn. This was investing in her future, in the life she would continue living here. "I couldn't ask you to do that," Clara said, though part of her yearned to accept. "You're already—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." He took a sip of coffee, his eyes never leaving hers. "Besides, the barn will be finished in a few days. Seems a shame to leave with work still to be done." Clara felt her heart skip. "You're planning to stay longer?" "If you'll have me." His voice was carefully neutral, but she caught the uncertainty beneath it. "Winter's coming, and there's plenty that needs doing. The fence, the chicken coop, the well housing." He was giving her practical reasons, safe reasons, but Clara heard what he wasn't saying. He didn't want to leave, and God help her, she didn't want him to go. "All right," she said softly. "We'll start with the garden." They worked side by side through the morning, Jack showing her how to build proper drainage channels while Clara salvaged what plants she could. The sun climbed higher, warming their backs, and Clara found herself stealing glances at him as he worked. He had removed his vest, and his shirt clung to his back with perspiration. There was a grace to his movements, a careful precision that spoke of a man who had learned to be deliberate in all things. "Tell me about your family," she said as they paused to rest in the shade of the house. "Besides your brother." Jack was quiet for a moment, his hands busy cleaning dirt from beneath his nails. "Not much to tell. Parents died when I was 15. Fever took them both within a week. David was only 12. I raised him best I could, working whatever jobs would take a boy willing to work like a man. That must have been hard." "It was." He looked out across the prairie. "But we managed. David was smart, smarter than me. Could have been something, maybe a teacher or a lawyer. Instead, he followed me to war because he couldn't stand the thought of me going alone." Clara reached out without thinking, her hand covering his where it rested on his knee. "You gave him a home, raised him. That matters." Jack looked down at her hand on his, and Clara suddenly realized what she'd done. She started to pull away, but he turned his palm up, catching her fingers gently. "Does it?" His thumb traced a light circle on her wrist. "Sometimes I think I just taught him how to die for someone else." "No," Clara said firmly. "You taught him how to love someone enough to save them. There's a difference." They sat there, hands linked, as the prairie wind whispered around them. Clara knew she should pull away, knew this was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but the warmth of his touch, the simple human connection after so much loneliness, was impossible to resist. It was Jack who finally released her hand, clearing his throat. "We should get back to work." They labored through the afternoon, rebuilding the garden bed by bed. As the sun began its descent, Clara surveyed their progress with satisfaction. The rows were straight and properly mounded, new stakes driven deep into the earth. "It looks better than it ever did," she said. "Just needs seeds now." Jack wiped his brow with his sleeve. "There's still time to get some winter vegetables in. Turnips, maybe some late cabbage." Clara tried to imagine winter vegetables growing, tried to see a future beyond the endless cycle of loss and survival. "I don't have any seeds left. Used the last of them in spring. Town's got them at Morrison's," Jack said. Then, more carefully, "I could ride in tomorrow, pick some up." The thought of him going to town, facing the hostility that would surely greet him after yesterday's confrontation, made Clara's stomach clench. "They won't welcome you. Not after I stayed despite their warning." Jack's smile held no humor. "Ma'am, I've been unwelcome in plenty of towns. One more won't break me." That evening, Clara found herself cooking a proper meal for two. It had been so long since she'd had reason to prepare anything beyond her simple fare that she fumbled with portions, making too much of everything. When she called Jack in from the barn, she felt suddenly nervous, aware of the intimacy of sharing a meal. He had cleaned up, his hair still damp from the pump, and when he entered her kitchen, he seemed to fill the space in a way that wasn't entirely about his physical presence. He looked at the laden table, fried chicken, potatoes, greens from the garden, fresh bread, and something soft passed over his features. You didn't need to. Sit, Clara said, more brusquely than intended. It's just food. But it wasn't just food, and they both knew it. It was an invitation, a widening of the circle she had drawn so tightly around herself. They ate in companionable silence at first, the clink of silverware and the ticking of the clock, the only sounds. Then Jack said, "Tell me about him. Samuel." Clara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Why? Because you loved him. Because he's part of your story. Because pretending he didn't exist doesn't honor either of you." Clara set down her fork, considering. No one had asked her to really talk about Samuel. They either avoided the subject entirely or mentioned him in hushed, reverent tones that bore no resemblance to the man she'd married. She paused, searching for words. He was difficult, proud, stubborn as a mule when he set his mind to something. We fought sometimes, really fought, not just disagreements. He'd storm out, spend the night in the barn. I'd lock the door and make him apologize through the keyhole come morning. Jack's mouth quirked. Did it work? Sometimes. Other times I'd find him asleep on the porch, too proud to beg but too smart to leave entirely. Clara smiled at the memory. He wasn't perfect. People want to make saints of the dead, but Samuel was just a man. He drank too much on Saturdays, worked too hard the rest of the week, and never remembered my birthday without prompting. But you loved him. Fiercely. Clara agreed. He was mine, flaws and all, and I was his when he died. She took a breath. When he died, I didn't just lose my husband. I lost my future. We were supposed to grow old together, supposed to have children who would work this land after us. Instead, I got a folded flag and the sympathy of people who didn't really know him at all. They finished the meal in thoughtful silence. When Jack rose to leave, Clara walked him to the door, reluctant to return to her empty evening routine. "Thank you," he said, "for dinner, for talking about him. I know it wasn't easy." "No," Clara agreed. "But maybe it needed to be done." He stood on the porch, hat in hand, seeming to wrestle with something. "Finally," he said. "That last night, before David died, we were sitting around the campfire, and he was talking about after the war, all the things he wanted to do, places he wanted to see. He had this girl back home, Mary Catherine. Said he was going to marry her, have a dozen kids, name them all after generals just to spite me." His voice caught, and Clara stepped closer without thinking. "The next morning, I told him to stay back, that I'd heard the fighting was going to be bad. He laughed, said I couldn't protect him forever, said—" Jack's jaw worked. "Said it was his turn to look after me. 4 hours later, he was dead." Clara reached up, her hand touching his cheek. He closed his eyes, leaning into the touch for just a moment before stepping back. "I should go." "Yes," she whispered, though every part of her wanted him to stay. She watched him walk to the barn, his figure dissolving into the gathering darkness. Inside, she cleared the dishes mechanically, her mind replaying the evening. The house felt emptier than ever, but somehow the emptiness was different now, not the suffocating absence of what had been, but the aching possibility of what might be. The next day, Jack rode to town as promised. Clara tried to busy herself with chores, but found herself watching the horizon for his return. When he finally appeared in late afternoon, she hurried out to meet him, telling herself it was only to help with the supplies. His face was grim as he dismounted. There was a smear of blood on his cheek, and his knuckles were scraped. "What happened?" Clara reached for him without thinking, her fingers hovering near the wound. "Nothing that hasn't happened before." He handed her a packet of seeds. "Got your turnips." "Jack." Some folks in town took exception to my presence. We had a discussion about it. Clara's temper flared. "Who? Sheriff Patterson?" "Doesn't matter." He touched the cut on his cheek gingerly. "Message was received. I'm not welcome in Mercy's Bend." "This is my land," Clara said fiercely. "You're welcome here." He looked at her then, something raw and vulnerable in his eyes. "Am I?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. Clara's heart hammered in her chest as she stepped closer, close enough to smell the dust and sweat and something uniquely him. "Yes," she whispered. His hand came up slowly, as if giving her time to step away. When she didn't, his fingers brushed her cheek, the touch feather-light but burning like a brand. "Clara, I know," she said. "I know all the reasons this is impossible. I know what people will say. I know." Her voice broke. "I know I still wear his ring and visit his grave and cry myself to sleep some nights. But I also know that when you're here, I remember what it feels like to be alive." Jack's thumb traced the line of her jaw. "I'm no good for you. I've got nothing to offer but broken pieces and bad dreams." "Then we match," Clara said, covering his hand with hers. "Because that's all I have too." They stood there in the yard, hands clasped, foreheads almost touching, breathing the same air. The sun sank lower, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, a coyote called, and its mate answered. "I should look at those seeds," Clara finally said, though she made no move to step away. "Tomorrow," Jack said. "They'll keep until tomorrow." That night, Clara lay in her too-large bed and stared at the ceiling. She didn't go to the cemetery that evening, and the guilt of that absence warred with something else, a warmth in her chest, a quickening of her pulse when she thought of Jack's touch. She was falling. She realized, falling toward something that could either save her or destroy what little she had left. But after 3 years of standing still, even falling felt like living. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Clara closed her eyes and let herself imagine, just for a moment, a different life. One where the house wasn't so empty, where laughter replaced echoes, where strong hands helped her work the land instead of her struggling alone. It was a dangerous dream, one that could shatter as easily as prairie ice. But for tonight, she held it close, a secret warmth against the encroaching cold of another winter. Tomorrow, she would plant turnips. Tomorrow, she would face whatever consequences came from this fragile thing growing between her and Jack. Tomorrow, she would figure out how to live with wanting something beyond mere survival. But tonight, she simply let herself feel. And for the first time in 3 years, her tears tasted more like hope than sorrow. The night was restless with wind and the promise of early frost. Clara couldn't sleep, her mind turning over the events of the past days like a farmer working stubborn soil. Near midnight, she heard it, a low groan from the barn, followed by what sounded like thrashing. She pulled her shawl over her nightgown and hurried out, her bare feet cold against the packed earth. The tack room door was ajar, lamplight spilling out in a thin line. Inside, she found Jack sitting on the edge of his cot, his face slick with sweat, his breathing ragged. "Jack!" His eyes snapped to hers, wild and unfocused. For a moment, he didn't seem to see her at all, his gaze fixed on some horror from the past. "It's all right," Clara said softly, approaching slowly as she would a spooked horse. "You're safe. It's just a dream." Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by embarrassment. "Clara, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to—" "Hush." She sat beside him on the narrow cot, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "The dreams come for Samuel sometimes too. When he was alive." Jack's hands were shaking. Without thinking, Clara took them in hers, feeling the calluses and scars, the evidence of a life hard-lived. "Tell me," she said. "It's always the same," he whispered. "David's dying, and I can't reach him. There's smoke and gunfire, and men screaming, and I can see him falling, but my legs won't move. He calls for me, and I can't." His voice broke. Clara shifted closer, her arm going around his shoulders. He was larger than her, stronger in every physical way. But in this moment, he seemed fragile as winter grass. "It wasn't your fault," she murmured. I know that here. Jack touched his temple. But here. He pressed a fist to his chest. Here, I'm still on that battlefield, still failing him. They sat in the lamplight, Clara holding him as his breathing slowly steadied. She was acutely aware of the impropriety of it, a widow in her nightclothes, embracing a man who wasn't her husband. But propriety seemed a small, cold thing compared to the warmth of human comfort. Clara, Jack said, his voice rough, you shouldn't be here. Neither should you. She replied, but here we are. He pulled back enough to look at her, his eyes searching her face. Why aren't you afraid of me? After what you've seen tonight? Because I've had my own nights like this. Because I know what it is to wake up reaching for someone who isn't there. Her hand came up to touch his face, fingers gentle on the bruise from his confrontation in town. Because broken doesn't mean dangerous. Something shifted in his expression, a wall crumbling. Clara. She knew what was coming, could feel it in the way the air changed between them. She should leave, should run back to her empty house and bar the door against this moment. Instead, she stayed perfectly still as Jack leaned closer, his breath warm against her lips. The kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant, a question more than a statement. Clara answered by pressing closer, her hands coming up to frame his face. 3 years of loneliness, of touch starvation, of nights spent clutching a pillow that no longer smelled like Samuel. It all poured into that kiss. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Jack's hands had found her waist, holding her as if she might disappear. This is madness, he said, but he didn't let go. Yes, Clara agreed, and kissed him again. This time there was nothing hesitant about it. Jack's arms came around her, pulling her against him, and Clara felt alive in a way she'd forgotten was possible. Her body remembered this, the wanting, the needing, the sweet ache of desire. They fell back onto the narrow cot, hands roaming, mouths hungry for connection. Clara's shawl fell away, and Jack's fingers tangled in her loose hair. Every touch was fire, every breath a small resurrection. Clara, Jack gasped against her throat. We should stop. You deserve— Don't, she interrupted, pulling back to look at him. Don't tell me what I deserve. I've had 3 years of what people think I deserve. Tonight, I want what I choose. He studied her face, his hand coming up to trace her cheekbone. And what do you choose? This, she whispered. You, us. Whatever that means. They came together again, slower this time, but no less intense. Clara felt the careful control Jack maintained, the way he held himself back even as his hands worshipped her body through the thin nightgown. She understood. He was giving her room to change her mind, to pull away. But pulling away was the last thing she wanted. In the lamplight, they discovered each other. The scar on Jack's ribs where the grape shot had nearly killed him. The birthmark on Clara's shoulder that Samuel used to kiss. The way Jack's breath caught when she traced the muscles of his back. The sound Clara made when he found the sensitive spot behind her ear. They didn't complete the act. Some last vestige of restraint held them back from that final line. But what they shared was no less intimate for its limits. They touched and tasted and memorized, storing up sensation against the cold days ahead. When exhaustion finally claimed them, they lay entwined on the narrow cot, Clara's head on Jack's chest, listening to his heartbeat. His fingers combed through her hair, the gesture achingly tender. What happens now? Clara asked softly. I don't know, Jack admitted, but I know I can't leave you, not unless you send me away. Then stay, she said simply. They dozed fitfully, waking to touch and murmur to each other, as if confirming the other's presence. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, reality began to intrude. You need to go back to the house, Jack said, though his arms tightened around her. Before anyone sees. Clara knew he was right, but leaving felt like tearing away part of herself. Tonight, we'll be more careful. He finished. This can't happen again. Clara, not like this. You have a reputation to protect. My reputation is already in tatters, According to the good people of Mercy's Bend, all the more reason not to give them ammunition. He sat up, gently disengaging from her. I won't be the reason you lose what you fought to keep. Clara pulled her shawl around her shoulders, suddenly cold. And if I say it's worth the risk? Jack's expression was pained. Then I'd say you're not thinking clearly. That what happened between us tonight, beautiful as it was, can't happen again. Not if I'm going to stay. The rejection stung. Even though Clara understood the logic behind it, she stood, wrapping her dignity around her like armor. I see. Clara! He caught her hand as she turned to go. This isn't... I'm not rejecting you. I'm trying to protect you. From the town. From scandal. From me. I don't need protection, Clara said, but her voice was gentler. I need... She stopped, unsure how to articulate the vast well of need inside her. I know, Jack said quietly. God help me, I need it too, but not at the cost of everything you've built here. Clara left then, slipping out into the pale dawn. The short walk to the house felt endless, her body still humming from Jack's touch, her mind churning with conflicting emotions. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had tasted something she'd thought lost forever. Inside the house, she caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. Her hair was wild, her lips swollen, her eyes bright with life in a way they hadn't been in years. She looked like a woman who had been thoroughly kissed, thoroughly awakened. She looked like a woman falling in love. The thought terrified her. Love meant vulnerability, meant the possibility of loss. She had loved Samuel with everything she had, and losing him had nearly destroyed her. Could she survive that again? But as she bathed and dressed, preparing for the day ahead, Clara realized the question was moot. The falling had already begun. The only choice now was whether to fight the gravity or surrender to it. She went to the cemetery that morning, the first time in days. Samuel's grave looked the same as always, but Clara felt like a stranger approaching it. I kissed him, she said without preamble. Jack, the man fixing our barn. I kissed him, and I wanted more. So much more. The wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves, but offered no absolution. I'm not asking for permission, Clara continued. You're gone, and I'm here, and I'm so tired of being alone, so tired of being cold. He makes me feel... She paused, searching for words. He makes me feel like spring might come again. She knelt and traced Samuel's name on the headstone. I'll always love you. That won't change. But I can't keep living like I died with you. I won't. When she returned home, Jack was already working, setting posts for the new fence. He looked up as she approached, and she saw her own turmoil reflected in his eyes. About last night, he began, was a mistake. Clara finished, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. You were right. It can't happen again. Relief and disappointment warred on his face. Clara, we have work to do, she said briskly. The fence won't build itself. They worked side by side through the morning, careful not to touch, careful not to let their eyes meet for too long. But awareness crackled between them like lightning before a storm. Every accidental brush of hands sent sparks through Clara's body. Every time Jack rolled his shoulders or lifted a heavy post, she remembered the feel of those muscles under her fingers. By midday, the tension was unbearable. Clara escaped to the house under the pretense of preparing lunch. But once inside, she leaned against the kitchen wall and tried to calm her racing heart. A knock at the door interrupted her turmoil. She opened it to find Margaret Patterson, the sheriff's wife, standing on her porch with a basket and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Clara, dear, Margaret said, pushing past her into the house. I thought we should have a talk. Clara's stomach sank. About what? About that man you've hired. Margaret set her basket on the table and began unpacking it. Preserves, bread. A pie that smelled of judgment more than apples. The whole town's talking. Let them talk. Oh, Clara. Margaret's voice dripped with false sympathy. You're young. You don't understand how quickly a reputation can be ruined, how doors can close, how a woman can find herself completely isolated. Is that a threat? Margaret's smile sharpened. It's a kindness. Send him away, dear, before something unfortunate happens. Like what happened to the widow Martinez? Clara asked quietly. When she refused the sheriff's suit and her well was poisoned. Margaret's face went pale, then flushed red. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Clara said. I'm simply remembering, just as I remember how my husband died because the mine owners were too cheap to shore up the tunnels properly. The same mine owners who sit on the town council with your husband. How dare you? Get out of my house. Clara's voice was ice. And tell your husband and the rest of them that if anything happens to my property, my animals, or Jack Calder, I'll ride to the territorial marshal myself. I have Samuel's journal from the mine. He documented every safety violation, every ignored warning. I wonder how interested the authorities would be in that information. Margaret gathered her things with shaking hands. At the door, she turned back. You're making a terrible mistake. Clara, that man will ruin you. Maybe, Clara said, but it will be my choice, my mistake to make. That's more than you can say, isn't it? Tell me, Margaret, when was the last time you made a choice that was truly your own? After the woman left, Clara sank into a chair, trembling with the aftermath of confrontation. She had just declared war on the town's power structure, all to protect a man she had known for barely 2 weeks, a man she was falling in love with. Jack appeared in the doorway, his expression concerned. I saw Mrs. Patterson leave. She looked upset. She came to warn me about you. I warned her instead. Clara, what did you do? She told him about the threat, about Samuel's journal. Jack's face grew increasingly grim as she spoke. You shouldn't have done that, he said when she finished. Now they'll come after you too. They were always going to come after me. Clara said, the moment I refused to play the grieving widow they wanted, the moment I chose to keep living. Jack crossed the room and knelt before her chair, taking her hands. I won't let them hurt you, and I won't let them drive you away. She squeezed his hands. We protect each other. That's what partners do. The word hung between them, weighted with possibility. Jack's thumb stroked over her knuckles, and Clara could see him wrestling with himself. Partners, he repeated softly. Is that what we are? I don't know, Clara admitted. But I'd like to find out. Carefully, slowly, with all the propriety we can manage. But I'd like to try. Jack lifted her hands and pressed a kiss to each palm. All right, he said. We'll try. That evening, they ate dinner together again. The table between them a necessary barrier. They talked carefully of safe things, the progress on the fence, the coming harvest, plans for winter preparations. But beneath the mundane conversation ran a current of awareness, of possibility. When Jack rose to leave for the barn, Clara walked him to the door as had become their custom. On the porch, he turned back to her. That journal, he said. Samuel's journal. Does it really exist? Clara smiled. Every word. Samuel was many things, but he was meticulous about documentation. He knew those mines were death traps. He was planning to go to the authorities after the spring thaw. Then the collapse happened. They killed him. Jack said, it wasn't a question. Not directly, but their negligence did. Clara looked out at the darkening sky. I've kept quiet because what good would it do? Samuel's gone. The other men are gone. But if they threaten what I'm building now, you'll fight. With everything I have. Jack touched her cheek, the gesture brief but tender. You're stronger than you know. Clara Whitmore. I'm learning, she said. Day by day, I'm learning. After he left, Clara stood on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast prairie sky. She thought about choices and consequences, about the price of happiness in a world that seemed determined to deny it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The town would respond to her threats. Jack would continue to wrestle with his desire and his honor, and she would have to navigate the treacherous path between her past and her future. But tonight, She had stood up for herself. She had chosen possibility over safety, hope over fear, and in Jack's careful touch, in his promise to try. She had found something she thought lost forever, a reason to face tomorrow with anticipation rather than dread. The night wind carried the scent of coming rain, of change on the horizon. Clara breathed it in, feeling more alive than she had in years. Whatever came next, she would meet it head on. She was done with merely surviving. It was time to live. The whispers started like prairie fire, small sparks that caught and spread until the whole town was ablaze with scandal. Clara felt the eyes on her whenever she ventured into Mercy's Bend for supplies, the way conversations stopped when she entered Morrison's store, the way women pulled their children closer as she passed. Shameless. She heard Mrs. Garrett hiss to her companion as Clara selected flour. Her husband not 3 years in the ground. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she paid Henry Morrison, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable with the situation. Outside, she found her wagon wheel had been loosened, not enough to cause immediate danger, but enough to send a message. Jack found her struggling with the wheel, trying to tighten it with shaking hands. "Let me," he said quietly, taking the wrench from her. "They're trying to break me," Clara said, her voice tight with suppressed tears. "They're trying to scare you. There's a difference." He worked efficiently, his movements sure. "Question is, will you let them?" That evening, Clara stood before her mirror, steeling herself for what she had to do. The church social was tonight, a monthly gathering she had avoided since Samuel's death, but hiding would only fuel the gossips further. She dressed carefully, choosing her best dress, still black, but with small pearl buttons that caught the light. She pinned her hair in a style that was severe but elegant. When she emerged from her room, Jack was waiting in the kitchen, having come to check on her after the day's events. He went still when he saw her. "Clara, I'm going to the social," she said, chin raised. "They want me to hide in shame. I won't give them the satisfaction. You're sure about this?" "No," she admitted. "But I'm going anyway. Will you—" She paused, knowing what she was about to ask was dangerous. "Will you come with me?" Jack's jaw tightened. "That would make things worse for you. Or it would show them I'm not afraid, that I have nothing to hide. But we do," he said softly. "We do have something to hide." The memory of their night together hung between them, unspoken but ever present. Since then, they had maintained careful boundaries, but the wanting hadn't diminished. If anything, the forced distance had only intensified it. "We've done nothing to be ashamed of," Clara said, though her cheeks warmed. "Haven't we?" Jack stepped closer, and Clara's breath caught. "Because shame isn't what I feel when I think about that night. When I remember how you felt in my arms, how you tasted." "Jack," Clara whispered, warning and plea combined. He stopped just short of touching her. "This is why I shouldn't go with you, because everyone will see it. What's between us? It's written all over my face every time I look at you." Clara's heart raced, but she forced herself to step back. "Then I'll go alone, as I've done everything alone for 3 years. She swept past him, grabbing her shawl, but he caught her arm gently. "Wait an hour," he said. "I'll arrive separately. At least you won't walk in there without an ally." The church hall was warm with lamplight and filled with the sound of conversation when Clara arrived. The moment she entered, a hush fell over the room. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes, the judgment in their stares. Head high, she made her way to the refreshment table where Margaret Patterson held court among the town's leading ladies. "Clara," Margaret said, her smile sharp as glass. "How? Unexpected to see you here. I've been remiss in my social duties." Clara replied evenly. "I thought it was time to remedy that." "Indeed. And how is your hired help working out?" Before the Clara could respond, Theodore Banks appeared at her elbow, his banker's smile oily with false concern. "Mrs. Whitmore, might I have a word? About your account." "My account is in order. Mr. Banks." "For now." But winter is coming, and a woman alone, with the additional expense of hired labor. He let the threat hang. Are you suggesting the bank might call in my loan? Clara kept her voice pleasant, aware of the audience. How interesting. I wonder what the Territorial Banking Commission would think about such practices, particularly if they knew about the irregularities in the Anderson foreclosure last spring. Banks's face flushed. I don't know what you mean. Don't you? Perhaps we should discuss it. Publicly. Clara turned to address the room. In fact, why don't we discuss all of it? The unsafe mine conditions that killed my husband and 4 other men, the poisoned wells, the burned barns, the mysterious accidents that befall anyone who refuses to fall in line. Clara. Sheriff Patterson stepped forward, his hand moving to his gun belt in what was meant to be a subtle threat. You're overwrought. Perhaps you should go home. Is that an order, Sheriff? Are you arresting me for speaking the truth? The room crackled with tension. Then the door opened, and Jack walked in. He had cleaned up, wearing what was probably his best shirt, his hair neatly combed, but there was something dangerous in his bearing, a coiled readiness that made several men step back. Evening, he said pleasantly, but his eyes never left the sheriff's hand near his weapon. Nice gathering. Mind if I join? This is a social for respectable folk. Patterson snarled. Then I'll fit right in. Jack replied. Nothing more respectable than an honest day's work, though I can see how that might be an unfamiliar concept to some. Reverend Michaels, who had been watching the escalating confrontation with growing alarm, stepped forward. Gentlemen, ladies, please, this is a house of worship. Surely we can what, Reverend? Clara interrupted. Turn the other cheek while they threaten widows and poison wells, quote scripture while they line their pockets with blood money. You're hysterical, Margaret Patterson declared. Charles, remove her. The sheriff started forward, but Jack shifted, placing himself between Patterson and Clara. He didn't touch her, didn't need to. His presence alone was shield enough. I'd think carefully about your next move. Sheriff, Jack said quietly. The lady's done nothing but speak her mind. Last I checked, that wasn't a crime, even in Mercy's Bend. You threatening me, drifter? Stating facts. Here's another one. I've seen what happens when lawmen forget they serve the people, not their own interests. It doesn't end well. The room held its breath. Clara could feel the violence hovering, waiting for one wrong word to unleash it. Then Henry Morrison cleared his throat. Perhaps we should all calm down. The shopkeeper said, Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Calder, would you care for some refreshment? My wife made her famous apple cider. It was a small gesture, taking their side publicly, but Clara saw others notice it. Doctor, Holworth nodded to her. The schoolmarm, Miss Grady, offered a tiny smile. Not everyone in Mercy's Bend had been corrupted by the Pattersons and Banks. The evening proceeded with brittle civility. Clara and Jack stayed on opposite sides of the room, but she was aware of him every moment, the way he positioned himself to keep her in sight. The quiet conversations he had with some of the men, the steady presence that allowed her to endure the whispers and glares. When she finally decided to leave, Jack was at the door first, holding it open. They walked out together, and Clara heard the explosion of gossip behind them. You shouldn't have come, she said as they reached her wagon. Neither should you. He helped her up to the seat. But I'm glad we both did. They'll make our lives miserable now. They were already planning to. Jack checked the wheels. All secure this time. At least now they know we won't go quietly. The ride home was silent, Jack following on horseback. When they reached the house, Clara found herself reluctant to go inside, to return to her solitary evening. Coffee, she offered. They sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge. The night was cool, autumn asserting itself more strongly each day. Tell me about after, Clara said suddenly. After the war, before you started drifting. What did you do? Jack was quiet for a long moment. Tried to go home, but home wasn't there anymore. The farm was gone, sold for taxes while I was fighting. The girl I'd been sweet on had married another man. Everything I'd thought I was fighting for had vanished. So you drifted. For a while. Then I got word about some men from my unit starting a ranch in Wyoming. Thought maybe I could build something new. His voice went flat. Raiders hit us the second year. Turned out one of my partners had made enemies during the war. They burned us out. Killed 2 of the men. I barely got away. Is that when... Clara gestured at his side, where the old injury lived. Different fight. Caught a rustler changing brands in Colorado. He objected to my interference. Jack's smile was grim. I objected harder. You've been running ever since. Not running, just not staying. Easier that way. Less to lose. Clara set down her coffee cup and turned to face him fully. What about now? Now? He met her eyes. Now I'm terrified. Of the town? Of you. The admission came rough. Of what you make me want. Of what I'd do to protect it. Clara's breath caught. Jack, I've killed men. Clara, in the war and after. I've done things that would horrify you. I'm not... He stopped, searching for words. I'm not a good man. Not the kind you deserve. I don't want a good man, Clara said fiercely. I had a good man. He worked himself to death trying to provide for me. Too proud to leave when he knew the mine was dangerous. I want an honest man, a survivor, someone who understands that sometimes the world doesn't give you good choices, only necessary ones. Jack stared at her, something raw and hungry in his expression. You don't know what you're saying. Don't I? Clara stood, moving to stand before him. I'm saying I choose you, with all your scars and shadows, just as you chose me, with all my grief and stubbornness. He rose slowly, his hands coming to rest on her arms. The town will crucify you for this. Let them try. She stepped closer, close enough to feel his warmth. I'm tired of living for their approval, tired of being half alive. When you kiss me, when you touch me, I remember who I was before loss carved me hollow. I want that woman back. Clara, his voice was strained. If I kiss you now, I won't want to stop. Then don't, she whispered. He groaned, pulling her against him, and their mouths met in a kiss that was nothing like their first tentative exploration. This was hunger and need, and 3 weeks of suppressed desire. Clara's hands tangled in his hair, holding him close as he backed her against the porch post. Inside? She gasped when they broke for air. Jack, please! But he was already lifting her, carrying her through the door as if she weighed nothing. They barely made it to the parlor before need overtook them again. Jack set her on her feet, his hands shaking as he touched her face. Are you sure? He asked. Clara, if we do this, we change everything. She finished. I know. I'm counting on it. They came together again, gentleness forgotten in the rush of want. Clara felt wild, reckless, alive in ways she'd forgotten possible. When Jack lifted her onto the settee, she didn't protest. When his hands found the buttons of her dress, she helped him. What followed was acclaiming, mutual and fierce. They learned each other in the lamplight, mapping scars and sensitive places, whispering promises and pleas. Clara discovered that Jack's control could shatter with the right touch, the right words. Jack found that Clara's propriety was a mask over deep passion, waiting to be unleashed. When they finally stilled, wrapped around each other on the narrow settee, Clara felt remade. The guilt she had expected didn't come. Instead, there was only a bone-deep satisfaction and a tenderness that made her throat tight. The town will know, Jack said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Women always know when another woman's been loved properly. Good, Clara said fiercely. Let them see that I'm alive, that I choose joy over their narrow expectations. They'll try to destroy you for it. They'll try anyway. She propped herself up to look at him. But I'm done being afraid. Samuel is dead. I'll always love him, always mourn him, but I won't die with him. Not anymore. Jack cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. What you said about choosing me, I meant it, Clara interrupted. Every word. Then choose all of me, he said. Not just the man fixing your barn, but the killer, the drifter, the broken soldier who wakes up screaming. Can you choose that? Can you choose me? Clara countered. The widow who'll always love her dead husband? The woman who's made enemies of the most powerful people in town? The stubborn fool who'd rather fight than yield? Yes, Jack said simply. To all of it. They kissed again, sealing the promise. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the prairie, wild and free. Inside, two damaged souls found in each other, not healing. That would come with time. But hope. Later, as they dressed with shaking hands and stolen kisses, reality crept back in. You can't stay in the barn anymore. Clara said, not after tonight. It would be a lie everyone would see through. I'll move to the house. Jack agreed. The spare room. We'll maintain what proprieties we can, even if we've already shattered the most important one. Clara finished. Yes? They both knew it was a fiction, that he would sleep in the spare room only until the lights were out and the world was asleep. But it was a necessary fiction, a small concession to the battles ahead. As Jack gathered his few possessions from the barn, Clara stood in her kitchen, looking at the space that had been hers alone for so long. Tomorrow, there would be consequences. The town would escalate their war against her. She would have to fight for her home, her land, her right to choose her own happiness. But tonight, she had remembered what it felt like to be fully alive, to want and be wanted, to choose love over fear. When Jack appeared in the doorway with his saddlebags, Clara smiled. Welcome home, she said. The words hung between them, weighted with promise and possibility. Then Jack crossed the room, set down his bags, and kissed her again. A kiss that tasted of new beginnings and defiant joy. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The first stone shattered the kitchen window at dawn, sending glass across Clara's breakfast table. She jerked back, coffee spilling, as Jack burst from the spare room with his rifle. Stay down, he ordered, moving to the broken window. Through the jagged hole came the sound of horses and hostile voices. Sheriff Patterson's rang out clearest. Whitmore, send that drifter out, and we'll consider being merciful. Clara crawled to the cabinet where Samuel had kept his shotgun. Her hands were steady as she loaded it, 3 years of solitude having taught her self-reliance. How many? She asked. 6, maybe 7. Jack's voice was calm, professional. The sheriff, Banks, and some hired muscle by the look of them. Clara, this time it was Theodore Banks. Be reasonable. You're living in sin with a stranger. Think of your immortal soul. Hypocrites, Clara spat. She moved to the other window, staying low. Banks has been visiting Maisie's sporting house every Thursday for 2 years, despite the danger. Jack's mouth quirked. How do you know that? Samuel's friend worked there as a bouncer. He told me after the funeral. Thought I should know what kind of man kept offering to save me. She checked the shotgun's load. I've been saving that information. Seems like a good time to use it. Another rock crashed through the parlor window. Last warning. Whitmore. Clara stood, keeping her body behind cover, but her voice carrying clear. Theodore Banks, before you lecture me on morality, perhaps you should explain to your wife about Thursday nights. Room 3 at Maisie's, isn't it? The one with the red curtains? Silence fell over the yard. Then Banks's voice, higher now, panicked. She's lying. Don't listen. Ask Maisie, Clara continued. Ask her about the birthmark on your— Enough, Patterson roared. You've made your choice. Woman, don't blame us for what comes next. The riders wheeled and galloped away. But both Clara and Jack knew this was far from over. They'll be back, Jack said, lowering his rifle. With more men, probably torches. We've got maybe until nightfall. Clara set down the shotgun and surveyed the broken glass littering her floor. Her hands wanted to shake now that the immediate danger had passed, but she wouldn't let them. Then we'd better prepare, she said. They spent the morning fortifying. boarding windows, filling buckets with water, loading every weapon in the house. Jack showed her how to reload quickly, how to move between windows without exposing herself to fire. "You've done this before," Clara observed, watching him secure a shutter. "More times than I care to remember." He paused in his work. "This is why I should leave. Draw them off. Let things calm down." "No." Clara's voice was steel. "We stand together or not at all." By afternoon, unexpected allies began to arrive. Henry Morrison came first, driving his wagon loaded with supplies and lumber. "Figured you might need some help," he said simply, ignoring Jack's surprised look. "What they're doing ain't right. A widow should be free to make her own choices." Dr. Holworth arrived next, medical bag in hand. "In case things turn ugly," he explained. "My Martha sends her regards. Mrs. Whitmore says to tell you she's praying for you both." Even Miss Grady, the spinster schoolmarm, appeared with her father's old rifle. "I've been under their thumbs for 20 years, she said, her usually timid voice firm. "Afraid to speak up, afraid to live. I won't watch them do it to someone else." By evening, they had a small but determined group. Not enough to win a pitched battle, but enough to make the cost of victory higher than Patterson might want to pay. As the sun set, Clara found herself alone with Jack on the porch, watching the horizon. "I never expected help," she admitted. "I thought we'd face this alone." "You gave them courage," Jack said. "Sometimes all people need is someone to go first, to show that resistance is possible." "I'm frightened," Clara confessed, the first crack in her brave facade. Jack took her hand, their fingers intertwining. "So am I, but I'd rather die defending something worth having than live running from it." "Don't talk about dying." Clara's grip tightened. "We're going to survive this. We have to." "Why?" She turned to face him fully. "Because I love you, because I've only just found you, and I refuse to lose you to their hate and small-mindedness." Jack went very still. "Clara, I know it's too soon. I know we've only known each other weeks, but I also know that when I wake up, you're the first thing I think of. When you smile, really smile, my heart feels too big for my chest. When you touch me, I come alive in ways I thought were buried with Samuel." She lifted their joined hands to her lips. "I love you." Jack called her, scars and shadows and all. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him. "God help me, I love you too." He whispered into her hair. "More than I thought possible. More than is safe for either of us." They kissed with desperate passion, aware it might be their last chance. When they broke apart, breathless, Clara saw riders approaching in the distance, many more than this morning. "They're coming," she said. "Then we'd better get inside." Jack's face had shifted into the hardness of a soldier. "Remember what I taught you. Stay low. Keep moving. Don't waste shots." Inside, their small band of defenders took positions. Clara found herself thinking absurdly of the dinner she'd never cooked, the evening she and Jack might have spent talking by the fire instead of preparing for battle. Patterson's voice rang out as the riders encircled the house. "This is your last chance. Whitmore, send out the drifter, and we'll let the rest of you leave peaceful-like." "Counteroffer," Clara called back. "You turn around and leave us be, and I won't send Samuel's journal to the territorial marshal, the one detailing every bribe you took to ignore mine safety violations." "You're bluffing." Clara moved to the window, staying behind cover but letting her voice carry. "January 15th, $50 from Consolidated Mining to overlook the rotted support beams in Tunnel 3. February 8th, $30 to ignore the methane readings. March 2nd. "Burn it down," Patterson roared. "Burn it all." The attack began with flaming torches arcing through the air. Most fell short, but one caught the barn roof, the same roof Jack had so carefully repaired. Clara's heart clenched watching his work burn, but there was no time for mourning. Gunfire erupted from both sides. Clara focused on her breathing, on Jack's instructions. Aim, fire, move. Don't think about the bullet splintering wood inches from her head. Don't think about anything but the next shot. Time lost meaning in the chaos of smoke and gunfire. Clara was aware of Jack moving through the house like a deadly ghost, appearing wherever the threat was greatest. She saw Henry Morrison take a bullet in the shoulder, but keep firing. She heard Miss Grady cursing with words no one would have believed she knew. Then, suddenly, Jack was there, tackling her to the floor as bullets shredded the air where she'd been standing. "You all right?" he asked, his body shielding hers. "Yes, but—" An explosion rocked the house. Someone had thrown dynamite, taking out most of the east wall. Through the smoke and debris, Clara saw Patterson himself entering, gun drawn. "There you are," the sheriff said, leveling his weapon at them. Jack moved to shield Clara, but she was already raising Samuel's shotgun. The blast caught Patterson in the chest, sending him backwards through the hole he'd entered. For a moment, silence fell. Then Banks's voice, high and panicked. "The sheriff's down! Dear God, she killed him!" The attack faltered. Without Patterson's leadership, the hired guns began to retreat. Banks screamed for them to continue, but self-preservation won out over pay, as quickly as it had begun. The battle was over. The house was badly damaged. One wall partially collapsed, windows shattered, smoke damage throughout. But they were alive. "Doctor." Hallworth immediately went to work on Henry's shoulder. Miss Grady sat in shocked silence, her father's rifle still clutched in her hands, and Clara stood in the ruins of her home, looking at the body of Sheriff Patterson. "You saved my life," Jack said quietly. "He was going to kill you." Clara's voice was steady, though she felt hollow inside. "I couldn't let that happen." "Clara, don't!" She turned to face him. "Don't tell me it wasn't necessary. Don't tell me I had a choice. He made his when he brought violence to my door." Jack studied her face, then nodded slowly. "All right." By dawn, word had spread throughout Mercy's Bend. The sheriff was dead. Banks had fled town, and Clara Whitmore had defended her home against overwhelming odds. The territorial marshal would have to be summoned. Investigations made. But for now, Clara stood in a ruined kitchen, trying to process what had happened. She had killed a man, crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The woman who had knelt by her husband's grave just weeks ago would have been horrified. This woman, the one forged by love and loss and the fierce need to protect what was hers, felt only weary acceptance. "We can't stay here," Jack said, surveying the damage. "Even if we rebuild, there'll always be those who remember, who'll want revenge." "I know." Clara touched the kitchen table, one of the few things undamaged. Samuel had made it as a wedding gift, carving tiny roses into the corners. "But I'm not ready to leave, not yet. The marshal will want statements. There'll be questions. We'll answer them. Tell the truth." Clara met his eyes. "That they came to burn us out because I chose to love you. That we defended ourselves. That I'd do it again." Jack crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. She breathed him in, gunpowder and smoke, and underneath it all, the scent that was uniquely his. "What now?" he asked into her hair. "Now we bury the dead. We thank our friends. We salvage what we can." She pulled back to look at him. "And then we decide where to go next. Together. You're sure about leaving everything behind?" Clara looked around the broken house, seeing not what was destroyed, but what had been. The life she'd built with Samuel, the isolation she'd wrapped around herself like armor, the woman she'd been before Jack arrived to crack her world wide open. "I'm sure about you," she said. "Everything else is just details." As the sun rose higher, illuminating the damage and the possibilities in equal measure, Clara began making mental lists. What to save, what to leave behind, what to carry forward into their uncertain future. The house could be rebuilt or abandoned. The land could be sold or kept. But the choice to love, to fight for that love, to build something new from the ashes of the old, that was already made. She had paid for it in blood and broken windows, in her reputation and her safety. But as Jack held her in the ruins of her old life, Clara knew she would pay it again. Some things were worth any price. The territorial marshal arrived 3 days after the battle. a weathered man named Thomas Brennan, who listened to testimonies with the patience of someone who had seen too much frontier justice to be surprised by anything. Clara told her story clearly, presenting Samuel's journal as evidence of the corruption that had led to the confrontation. Self-defense. Brennan concluded after 2 days of investigation. Clear as day. Though I suggest you both consider relocating, this kind of bad blood doesn't wash away easy. Clara stood in the ruins of her parlor, watching Jack repair what could be salvaged. They had been invited to stay with Dr. Holworth until they decided their next move, but Clara returned each day to sort through the remnants of her life. There's a letter, Henry Morrison said, appearing in the broken doorway. His arm was still in a sling from the bullet wound, but he'd insisted on helping. From the bank in Denver, seems Banks had some irregularities in his bookkeeping they've discovered. They're willing to forgive your loan as compensation for difficulties. Clara took the letter, reading it twice to believe it. The land is mine free and clear? Appears so. You could sell it for a good price. Start fresh somewhere else. That evening, Reverend Michaels approached her after she'd visited Samuel's grave, her first visit since the battle. The elderly minister looked troubled but determined. Mrs. Whitmore, he began formally, then softened. Clara, I owe you an apology. I stood by while others persecuted you, told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, but silence in the face of injustice is its own sin. Reverend, please let me finish. He pulled out a worn envelope. The church council met yesterday. There are those who want to see you formally condemned, but others, more than you might expect, who admire your courage. The vote was close, but... He handed her the envelope. We'd like to offer you and Mr. Calder the use of the church for a proper wedding ceremony, if you're so inclined. Clara stared at the envelope, speechless. After everything, to be offered this recognition, this acceptance of her choice. That's kind of you, Reverend, but think about it. He interrupted gently. Whatever you decide about staying or going, you deserve to have your union blessed properly. Love that's been tested by fire deserves recognition. That night, Clara found Jack standing in what had been the kitchen garden, staring at the stars. She slipped her arms around him from behind, pressing her cheek to his back. The marshal cleared us, she said, and the bank forgave the loan. We're free to go wherever we want. Where do you want to go? Jack asked, covering her hands with his. I've been thinking about that. Clara moved to stand beside him. You mentioned Wyoming once, said you tried to build something there before it went bad. That was a different place, different time. But you know the territory. Know where the good land is, where we could start fresh. She took a breath. I want to try again. Jack, not just running to escape something, but going towards something. Building a real life together. Jack turned to face her fully. There's a valley I remember. Good water, sheltered from the worst of the winter winds. Mountain meadows for grazing. It's a 2-week ride from the nearest town, isolated but peaceful. Sounds perfect. Clara reached up to touch his face. Reverend Michaels offered us the church for a wedding. Jack went very still. Clara, I know we can't truly marry, not legally, not with me still wearing Samuel's ring. She twisted the band she'd worn for 6 years. But maybe it's time to let some things go. She pulled the ring from her finger slowly. It left a pale band of skin, a ghost of the promise it had represented. Clara looked at it for a long moment, then tucked it into her pocket. I'll bury it with him tomorrow, she said. A final goodbye. And then, she met Jack's eyes. Then I'd like to make new promises, whether the law recognizes them or not. Jack crushed her to him, his embrace fierce with emotion. Are you sure? People will still talk, will still... Let them talk. Clara pulled back to look at him. I know what we are to each other. God knows. That's enough for me. 3 days later, Clara stood once more at Samuel's grave. The cemetery was quiet in the early morning light, mist rising from the grass. She knelt and dug a small hole beside the headstone, then placed her wedding ring inside, along with a letter she'd written the night before. "I loved you," she said aloud. "I'll always love you, but I can't live in your shadow anymore. I hope wherever you are, you understand. I hope you'd want me to be happy." She covered the ring with earth, patting it smooth. When she stood, she felt lighter somehow, as if she'd finally set down a burden she'd carried so long she'd forgotten its weight. Jack was waiting by the cemetery gate, holding the reins of 2 horses loaded with their possessions. Everything they owned fit in saddlebags and bedrolls. A humbling and freeing realization. "Ready?" he asked. Clara took a last look at the grave, at the town spread below, at the life she was leaving behind. Then she mounted her horse with decisive grace. "Ready?" They rode through town openly, no longer caring who saw them together. Some people turned away, but others, Henry Morrison, Dr. Holworth, even Miss Grady, raised their hands in farewell. Clara had planted seeds of change in Mercy's Bend, small acts of defiance that might grow in their absence. The house stood empty behind them, too damaged to sell immediately, but the land beneath it valuable enough to provide funds for their new start when the time came. Clara didn't look back. She'd taken what mattered: Samuel's journal, a few photographs, her mother's china teacups wrapped carefully in cloth. The rest was just walls and wood. They traveled steadily west, following trails Jack remembered from his wandering years. At night, they camped under vast skies, talking about their plans, their hopes, the life they would build. Clara discovered that Jack could play the harmonica, coaxing melancholy tunes from the small instrument. Jack learned that Clara could recite Shakespeare from memory, a skill from her schoolgirl days that she'd hidden in Mercy's Bend. On the 4th day, they encountered a traveling preacher heading east. The man was young, earnest, with kind eyes that reminded Clara of her brother. "Could use some company for the noon meal," the preacher offered. "Gets lonely on the trail." They shared beans and cornbread, talking of inconsequential things. Then the preacher asked, "You folks married? Planning to be?" Clara and Jack exchanged glances. "It's complicated," Clara said. "Love often is." The preacher smiled. "I'm ordained. You know, not much for ceremony out here, but the words still count, if you're wanting them." It wasn't the church wedding Reverend Michaels had offered. There were no flowers, no music, no witnesses save the horses and the endless sky. But as they stood beside a clear mountain stream, hands joined, repeating vows that no law would recognize but their hearts held sacred. Clara felt more married than she ever had in Mercy's Bend's finest church. "By the power vested in me by God and the territory of Colorado," the young preacher concluded, "I pronounce you husband and wife in the eyes of the Lord. If not the law, may you find in each other shelter from the storm." When Jack kissed her, Clara tasted promise and possibility. The salt of tears she hadn't realized she was crying. They parted from the preacher with thanks and a small donation for his ministry. As they rode on, Jack reached over to take Clara's hand. "No regrets?" he asked. "None." Clara squeezed his fingers. "You? Only that I didn't find you sooner." They rode in companionable silence, wedding rings fashioned from twisted horsehair on their fingers, temporary tokens until they could afford proper bands. The territory stretched before them, vast and challenging but full of potential. On the 10th day, they crested a ridge, and Jack pointed to the valley below. "There," he said. "That's the place I remembered." Clara caught her breath. The valley spread like a green jewel between protective mountain walls. A stream wound through it, catching the light like silver thread. She could see where they'd build, on the slight rise overlooking the water, sheltered by aspens that would turn gold come fall. "It's perfect," she whispered. "It'll be hard work," Jack warned. "Starting from nothing, building through winter, no neighbors for miles." "Good." Clara turned in her saddle to smile at him. "I've had enough of neighbors for a while." They descended into their valley as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Clara felt like she was riding into a painting, into a dream made real. That night, they slept under the stars in what would be their home. Jack held her close, their bedrolls joined, their bodies generating warmth against the mountain chill. "I love you," Clara said into the darkness. "I want you to know, if something happens, if this dream doesn't work out, I'll never regret choosing you. Choosing this." "Nothing's going to happen," Jack said firmly. "We've paid our dues in blood and sorrow. It's time for something better. Promise?" "I promise to try, to work every day to build something worthy of your trust. That's all any of us can do." It was enough, more than enough. Clara closed her eyes and listened to the night sounds of their new home, the stream's constant murmur, an owl's distant call, the wind through the aspens, different from the prairie winds of Mercy's Bend, gentler somehow. She thought briefly of Samuel, hoped he was at peace, hoped he'd understand. Then she let that last tie to her old life drift away on the mountain breeze. Tomorrow, they would begin the hard work of building. They'd fell trees for a cabin, dig irrigation channels, plan for crops and livestock. They'd face setbacks and struggles, harsh weather and isolation, but they'd face them together. Two survivors who had found in each other not just love, but partnership, understanding, a shared strength greater than either possessed alone. Clara pressed closer to Jack, feeling his heartbeat against her back, steady and sure. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, not the harsh cry of the prairie coyotes, but something wilder, freer. Its mate answered from across the valley, and Clara smiled. They had found their place, carved from wilderness and determination. It would never be easy, this life they'd chosen, but it was theirs, built on truth and trust rather than respectability and fear. And that, Clara thought as sleep finally claimed her, made all the difference. 1 year later, Clara stood in the doorway of their cabin, watching the morning sun paint the valley in shades of gold and green. The structure behind her was modest but solid. 2 rooms built with their own hands, chinked against the wind, with real glass windows they'd hauled from the nearest town. Jack was working with the horses in the corral they'd built near the stream. They had 6 now, 2 for riding, 4 for the breeding program they hoped would sustain them. Clara watched him move among the animals with that easy grace she'd never tired of observing, and her hand went unconsciously to her belly. She hadn't told him yet, had only become certain herself a week ago when the morning sickness could no longer be attributed to something she'd eaten. After years of believing herself barren, she and Samuel had tried for children without success. This pregnancy felt like a miracle wrapped in terror. "You're up early," Jack said, approaching the cabin. His hair was longer now, touched with more silver, but his face had lost the haunted look it carried when they'd met. "Couldn't sleep." Clara accepted his good morning kiss, lingering in his embrace. Too much to think about. The supply run? They were planning a trip to town, a 3-day journey to stock up before winter. It would be Clara's first time back in civilization since they'd arrived in the valley. "That and other things." Clara pulled back to study his face. "Jack, what would you think about expanding the cabin? Adding another room? We could use the storage space." He agreed. "Maybe next spring, after—" He stopped, really looking at her. "Clara, we'll need more than storage space," she said softly. "We'll need a nursery." The emotions that crossed his face made Clara's heart clench. Shock, joy, fear, wonder, all in quick succession. His hands came to frame her face, trembling slightly. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor. But yes, I think so. Think spring, most likely." Jack pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair. She felt him shaking and realized he was crying. This man who had endured war and loss and violence without breaking was undone by the promise of new life. "I never thought," he whispered. "Never dreamed I'd have this chance. A family. After David died. I assumed that part of life was closed to me." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, though she could feel the answer in the way he held her. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it." He pulled back, wiping his eyes without shame. "Also terrified. What if I'm no good at it? What if, then we'll learn together? Clara interrupted. The same way we've learned everything else this year, by trying, failing sometimes, and trying again. They stood together in the morning light, hands linked over the promise growing within her. The valley stretched before them, their small herd grazing peacefully. The garden they'd coaxed from the mountain soil showing the last of the season's harvest. It hadn't been easy. This first year, they'd nearly frozen the first winter, huddled together as snow piled against the half-finished cabin walls. Spring had brought flooding that washed out their first attempt at irrigation. Summer had meant backbreaking work from dawn to dusk, falling into bed too exhausted for anything but sleep. But they'd survived. More than survived. They'd begun to thrive. The cabin was snug now, provisioned with preserved foods and firewood. The horses were healthy, 2 of the mares already bred for spring foals, and between them, the careful trust of their first days had grown into something deep and unshakable. "We should go to town sooner," Jack said. "Make sure you see a doctor. Get whatever you need." "I need you to stop panicking," Clara said with a laugh. "Women have been having babies in valleys like this since the world began. But yes, we can go to town. I want to send a letter anyway." She'd been corresponding with Miss Grady, who had shocked everyone by marrying Dr. Holworth's widowed son, and seemed deliriously happy about it. The last letter had brought news that Henry Morrison had been elected mayor. That reform was slowly coming to Mercy's Bend. They prepared for the trip carefully, Jack fussing over every detail of Clara's comfort until she threatened to make him sleep in the barn. The journey that had seemed like freedom a year ago now felt daunting with new life to protect. The town of Sanctuary, an optimistic name for a rough collection of buildings, had grown since their last visit. A new general store competed with the old one, and someone had even opened what they generously called a hotel. Doctor. Marcus Webb was a young man fresh from medical school back east, eager and competent. His examination was gentle, his manner reassuring. "Healthy as a mountain cat," he pronounced. "About 3 months along. I'd say you'll want to come back in late winter, closer to your time. Earlier if you can manage it." Clara gripped Jack's hand as relief washed over her. Real? Confirmed. They were going to be parents. They stayed in town 2 days, gathering supplies and baby necessities that made Jack go pale at the cost. Clara found herself standing before the general store's small selection of fabric, touching soft cotton and warm wool, imagining tiny clothes. Yellow, she decided, and green, colors that work regardless. "You don't want to know?" Jack asked. "I want to be surprised. I want that moment of discovery." She smiled up at him. "Don't you?" They left town with a loaded wagon, including lumber for the cabin addition and a rocking chair Jack insisted on buying despite Clara's protests about the expense. "Every mother needs a rocking chair," he said firmly. "I remember my mother and hers, singing lullabies. It's one of my only clear memories of her." The return journey was slower with the wagon, but Clara didn't mind. She felt cocooned in possibility, in the future growing inside her and beside her. Jack talked more than usual, making plans, worrying aloud, dreaming of teaching a son to ride or a daughter to shoot. Either way, they'll know they're loved. Clara said, "That's what matters most." They reached the valley as snow began to fall, the first of the season. Jack immediately set about securing the supplies while Clara built up the fire and started soup. Domestic rhythms they developed, a dance of partnership where each knew their role. That night, as snow whispered against the windows, they lay entwined in their bed. A real bed now, not just blankets on the floor. Jack's hand rested on her still flat stomach, marveling at the secret it held. "I've been thinking," Clara said, "about names." "Already? If it's a boy." She paused, wondering if this was wise. "I'd like to call him David, for your brother, if you don't mind." Jack's breath caught. "Clara, he saved your life. Without him, you wouldn't have survived to find me. It seems right to honor that sacrifice. And if it's a girl?" Clara smiled in the darkness. "Rose, for my mother. And because I want her to bloom wherever she's planted, like wild roses in difficult soil. David, or Rose Calder, Jack said, testing the names. Our child. God. Clara. Our child. They made love gently, mindful of their precious burden. Afterward, Clara lay listening to the snow and Jack's steady breathing, her hand over his on her belly. She thought of the journey that had brought them here, the grief, the violence, the choice to love despite the cost. A letter from Mercy's Bend, forwarded through several towns, had reached them a month ago. Margaret Patterson had written, of all people, to say Clara's stand had inspired other women in town to demand better. The mine had new owners who prioritized safety. The corruption that had ruled for so long was slowly being rooted out. You lit a fire, Margaret had written, that continues to burn. I hope you've found the peace you deserve. Peace. Clara considered the word. What they had wasn't quite peace. It was too dynamic for that, too full of growth and change and challenge. But it was life, real and vivid and worth every struggle. Can't sleep? Jack murmured, pulling her closer. Just thinking. About how I stood at Samuel's grave that day, ready to lie down and wait for death. About how you showed up with your ladder and your quiet strength and reminded me I was still alive. You saved yourself, Jack said. I just happened to be there when you remembered how to fight. We saved each other, Clara corrected. And now we have someone new to save us both, Jack finished. To give us a reason to build something that lasts longer than our own lives. The snow continued to fall, blanketing their valley in pristine white. Come spring, it would melt and feed the stream, water their expanded garden, nurture new growth. The cycle of seasons that had once seemed like endless repetition now felt like promise. Clara closed her eyes and said a prayer of gratitude. To God, to fate, to Samuel for understanding, to Jack for being brave enough to stay. Her hand found her wedding ring, the simple gold band Jack had bought in Sanctuary to replace the horsehair placeholder. It caught the firelight when she moved, a small brightness in the dark. I love you, she whispered to Jack, to their unborn child, to the life they'd built from ashes and determination. And I love you, Jack replied, his voice thick with emotion. Both of you. All of this. Every difficult, beautiful, unexpected bit of it. Outside, the snow transformed their valley into something magical, a blank page waiting for new stories. Clara smiled, feeling the flutter of movement in her womb. Too early to be the baby. Probably just imagination. But she chose to believe it was a greeting, a promise, a tiny celebration of life continuing despite all odds. They had traveled so far from that windswept cemetery in Mercy's Bend, that broken-down barn, that first tentative touch of hands. The journey had cost them everything they'd thought they were, but it had given them everything they'd never dared to dream. And it was only the beginning. As sleep finally claimed her, Clara's last thought was of spring, of green shoots pushing through snow, of new life entering the world, of the garden they would plant together with small hands helping for the first time. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer fearsome. They had chosen love over fear, hope over despair, life over mere survival. In a valley carved by their own hands from wilderness, two broken souls had built something whole, and soon, that wholeness would grow beyond themselves, reaching into the future with tiny fingers and unlimited possibilities. The snow fell softly on their cabin roof, a benediction and a blessing. Inside, wrapped in warmth and love and the promise of tomorrow, Clara and Jack Calder slept peacefully, their joined hands resting on the miracle between them. Their story, born of loss and loneliness, tempered by struggle and sacrifice, transformed by love, would continue with the turning of seasons and the laughter of children yet to be born. In choosing each other, they had chosen life in all its messy, difficult, glorious fullness, and that choice made all the difference. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Clara and Jack's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. Please comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from. I'd love to connect with fellow Western romance fans. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about the story. Did you cry? Did you cheer? What was your favorite moment? Let's discuss in the comments.